Howdy, y'all. Today we're going to talk about testimony, which is the act of someone telling you that something is the case. So this is uh, one of the sort of two sources of information that Lewis discusses in Chapter 4 of The Power of Critical Thinking. And we're going to discuss sort of the conditions under which testimony can be reliable, and then situations in which you should be a little bit more skeptical of testimony, or at the very least, you should demand actual evidence instead of just accepting what somebody says just by their say-so. So this sort of section, this chapter, is right after Chapter 3, which is discussing arguments and different types of arguments. And one of the things that we discussed in Chapter 3 were the two questions. So let me just kind of put this up here. But the two questions that we sort of care about when thinking about arguments are the premises true, and does the conclusion follow logically from those premises? So the issue that we discussed with the patterns and the types of arguments and whether or not conclusions follow logically from the premises is a question of logic. And that's one of the questions, but there's also this question about whether or not the premises are true. But the issue with when you start looking at the truth of the premises, you have sort of two options. Either when you sort of evaluate that premise, you look at some evidence, right, to see whether or not you're justified in believing the premises, which invites essentially another argument, or you can accept that premise without being sort of presented with direct evidence. So let's just sort of consider those sort of two options. So if you go with option one, that's fine, but bear in mind that this could sort of go on ad infinitum, which is to say that if you ask for sort of another argument in favor of this premise, well, those are going to have premises too, and you're going to ask the same question as to whether or not those premises are justified, and could you supply an argument for those premises, and so on and so forth. So at some point, it seems, to avoid this infinite sort of regress, you're going to have to accept a claim without direct evidence. You're going to have to go with number two. And there are situations in which that's perfectly fine as sort of a stopping point. But what we're going to sort of discuss is that, well, that will be okay if and only if you have a reliable source of information, that you have a source of information that you can say sort of more or less is going to probably sort of get it right. And that's where the issue of sort of testimony comes in, and also the issue of personal experience. So in the next video, we're going to talk about the reliability of personal experience, but here we're going to talk about the reliability of testimony. So what is testimony? Testimony, as I sort of mentioned at the very beginning, is just a situation where somebody or something says that something is the case. So they're not presenting sort of evidence, and what you have is sort of the claim itself is sort of being stated without evidence. So part of what we're going to do, or at least to start off just sort of thinking about testimony, is to think at first about just sort of the claim itself. That the claim itself, you're going to want to sort of assess the initial plausibility of that claim. You're going to want to check it against your own background information, the things that you have good reason to believe are true. And the reason that we sort of do that is that the more implausible the claim, the higher the bar, and the harder it's going to be to just sort of take it to be true on somebody's word. So the fact that something is plausible or implausible doesn't mean it's sort of true or false, but it does sort of tell us something about sort of how much evidence we're going to need and how easy it is going to be to just take somebody at their word. Um, but again, sort of the important part of the testimony, though, is over here on the left. Is this the testifier, right? The thing that is telling us that something is the case. That's where this discussion of reliability and credibility is going to be. We're going to be talking about sort of the source of the claim primarily here, and not about the claim itself. So the source of the claim is could be a person, it could be a group of people, it could be an institution, um, typically made up of people. But that is what we're going to sort of consider is what can we say about the sort of the credibility or the reliability of the source. And typically, when we think about sort of the source, we think about sort of two things. We think about whether or not the source sort of knows that P, or would be sort of in a position to know that P, and then also whether or not they have a reason to be sort of insincere with us, which is to say that they might have a reason to lie to us. So even if you know the answer, or the testifier knows the answer, there may be some reason to think that they are not telling us the truth. And we'll talk a little bit about what those conditions will look like. But this kind of sets up sort of the general theory. Um, okay, so we're going to start by thinking about sort of assessing the credibility of the source with this general principle that brings sort of the two ideas together of having knowledge and being sincere. So we're just going to say that as a general principle, and this isn't always going to be the case, but usually if a source is in a position to know that P and they are being sincere, then P is probably true. So this is sort of an inductive inference here that if we use this as sort of a premise to an argument, then if it turns out that yes, they are knowledgeable and yes, they're being sincere, then we're probably going to get the right answer. So we want to think about sort of the ways in which we sort of assess whether or not somebody is in a position to know, and their sincerity. So let's start with being sort of in a position to know. What do we sort of care about? What do we want to know about our testifier? So one thing we want to know is whether or not they have access to the appropriate information. So suppose I am asking somebody the time, and so the testifier would be the person sort of telling me what time it is. And one thing that we would want them to have is access to the information, right? We would want them to have a phone or watch, and one that is set to the correct time, and so on and so forth. We want to have some reason to believe that this individual or group of individuals or whomever is testifying to us has access to the appropriate information. Furthermore, we want to know whether or not this individual has sort of the requisite experience or the requisite sort of skills and training to interpret that information. So on top of just having access to the information, it may be the case that being able to sort of turn that information into knowledge requires some amount of skill or some amount of experience. So for example, using sort of the time telling case, it's important that the individual actually knows how to tell time, right? That they can look at a watch face and be able to sort of extract from that the time. So for the most part, when it comes to sort of telling time, that's what you need to be able to do. But this brings up this other issue that we have to sort of think about, that depending on sort of what the testifier is testifying about, that's going to change what is sort of required here, like what kind of information they need to have access to, what sort of requisite sort of experience or skills or training or education or whatever you want to call it is going to be needed. So when it comes to somebody telling time, most people have the requisite skill and training, but when it comes to quantum physics, very few people have the requisite sort of skill and training in the subject. So again, depending on sort of what is being testified about, is going to change what sorts of things we're going to think about and care about when it comes to assessing the credibility of the source. All right, so here's the other issue, whether or not the person is being sincere. So basically this is just, to think about this, we just want to think about, well, what are the conditions that would make somebody lie to us? So the most common sort of condition that would get somebody to lie to us would be that they have something to gain, that they're sort of an interested party. So they will gain by lying, and thus they have sort of an incentive to lie. So what's one way to gain by lying? Money, right? So maybe they are getting paid to say something that they know is untrue, right? Or maybe there's some monetary incentive to say something that they know is untrue. So I think of advertisers under this sort of condition, right? That if you're advertising a product that you know is crap, you're not going to say that it's crap because you want people to buy it. So along with Monday, maybe some sort of personal agenda. So not necessarily a financial gain, but some other gain. Maybe you have sort of a political agenda or some ideological agenda that would cause you to sort of put falsehood over truth, right? That's a possibility. Or some other personal stake. Maybe your identity is tied into something being true, and thus you're sort of biased or, or willing to settle for sort of falsehood. So on top of, just sort of thinking about whether or not somebody has something to gain or whether or not they're an interested party, another thing that you can consider if this is sort of available to you is their sort of history. That to think about whether or not somebody is being sincere may require sort of a look at past statements that they've made. So if they're sort of a public figure or they have some track record that you could take a look at, this is another way of sort of thinking about whether or not somebody is being sincere. So if they have a history of being sincere and not dissembling, then that's good, right? Then you have some reason to think that they are being sincere. Or if they have a history of being kind of a liar, then of course you wouldn't want to trust anything that they have to say. So that's pretty much it. You want to consider just whatever sort of evidence that you could muster. Again, bearing in mind that they're not actually giving you evidence for the thing that we're talking about, right? They're not giving you sort of evidence for P. So the option here is to consider evidence for the reliability of the source. So any evidence that they are or are not in a position to know, and then any evidence that they are or are not being sincere. So, and again, generally, if you have some reason to believe that they are in a position to know and that they are being sincere, then you can infer that P is probably true. Real quick here before we move on to some examples, I just want to make this sort of warning to you that if the source of the claim is not credible, that does not mean that the thing that they're saying is false. Even if they have sort of a history of sort of falsehood, you need to bear in mind that usually what's going to happen here is it means you need to sort of withhold judgment, that you don't really have evidence sort of one way or the other, because, well, first of all, you weren't presented with evidence, you were just presented with testimony. So if somebody is not a credible source, it's still possible and maybe even probable that their beliefs are true, It's just that you have no reason to accept them until you've been given sort of evidence, or you actually sort of find a credible source. So this is something to sort of bear in mind, like when you write papers, right? Just because a piece of information is out there and the source that you have isn't credible, doesn't mean that there isn't evidence to be found, or that there isn't a credible source somewhere. So just something to bear in mind. Okay, so let's end this little video here with some examples, some things to sort of think about in terms of whether or not somebody is a credible source. So example number one is the classic sort of celebrity endorsement. So I don't know who's endorsing things these days. I think Serena Williams is probably still endorsing Nike, or still has an endorsement deal with Nike. And I know she gets paid crazy amounts of millions of dollars to say that Nike is a useful product. But anyway, think of any sort of endorsement, any celebrity who's saying that something is good or something is worth buying. And so let's think about whether or not these individuals meet the appropriate sort of conditions for expert evidence, right, or testimony. So are celebrities in a position to know? Well, maybe. It depends on what they're selling. So if Serena Williams is talking about shoes, well, she's a tennis player, and maybe she knows, right? Maybe she has the requisite sort of experience and sort of understanding of what makes for a good shoe. And that's a possibility. If Serena Williams is selling us skin cream, um, you know, maybe not, right? She's less likely to have sort of the requisite skill or training in telling us the pharmacological aspects of something. Um, so it depends, right, on sort of the thing being sort of sold or thing being hawked. But that's not the big problem with celebrity endorsement. The big problem with celebrity endorsement is the possibility that they're not being sincere. So again, they may be being sincere, but you should always sort of bear in mind that celebrities are being paid to say what they have to say. So it could be very well possible that they are just saying uh, these things to get a big fat check. I know, at least with me, and maybe this says something about my lack of moral backbone, but if somebody gave me $1 million to say that, um, I don't know, Pepsi was delicious, I would say that Pepsi is delicious, even though I do not think that that is true. So always bear in mind that if somebody's getting paid to say something, then you don't really have a good sense of them being truthful. All right, here's another example. This one may be hitting too close to home, but what about your professors here at Edgewood? Do they know what they're talking about? Well, it depends. Bear in mind that people with PhDs like myself like to think that we know something about everything, and that's just not true. So be careful when professors start talking about things. If they're talking about stuff that is in their field, then it's likely that they are in a position to know. Typically, that is what they are trained in, and what they have sort of a history of learning about. But if they are speaking authoritatively of something outside their field, then be quite suspicious, or at the very least, don't be too credulous. These days, with the pandemic being sort of everywhere, everyone thinks that they're an epidemiologist. And having a doctorate in education does not make you an epidemiologist. It does not make you an expert in infectious diseases. So be careful when somebody is speaking outside of their field. But what about their sincerity? Do Edgewood professors have a reason to lie to you? Probably not. Oops. Um, Oh, I'm sorry. That's right. So the question is, are they being sincere? The answer is, yeah, probably. Probably this sincerity condition is met. Why is this? Well, it'd be really hard to imagine what a professor would have to gain by lying to you. I suppose there could be some situations in which a professor's ideological agenda has sort of overwhelmed their ability to uh, transmit information sort of truthfully, but I think sort of in general, that is frowned upon, and most professors are not here to push an agenda, but rather to educate. At least I hope so. Here's another example. How about something that a friend shared on social media? And in particular, something where you don't know the source. Well, are they in a position to know? You have no idea because you don't know the source. Are they being sincere? You have no idea. This is part of the problem with social media is so much stuff without attribution gets shared and moved about, and there's a feeling that there is a source somewhere, but nobody knows where it comes from, and this was why misinformation spreads so quickly, is nobody does the work to actually sort of check the source, and so you get rumors and craziness, and that's why social media is so terrible when it comes to people being educated about things. All right, how about this? I mentioned the time telling example. What about asking a complete stranger the time? Well, believe it or not, this is one of the more reliable sources of testimony, because most people are in a position to know as long as you're asking somebody who's past the first grade. They probably know how to sort of tell time, and also most people, assuming that you're asking someone with a phone or a watch, most people are walking around with something that's sort of set to the right time, so they have access to the correct information and they have the requisite experience. And do you have reason to think that they are sincere? Are they going to be sincere with you? Probably. It's be weird, or at least rare, to be in a situation where a stranger has something to gain by lying to you about what time it is. So usually, strangers will tell you the right time. The strangers don't have anything to gain by lying to you. It's actually people who know you who are sort of more likely to lie to you about the time. I lie to my wife and kids about the time quite often in order to try to hurry people out the door. That I say that it's 10 to 6 when in fact it's 20 to 6, just in hopes that we'll move a little bit more quickly, so we can, go ride our bikes or go do whatever it is we're going to do. All right. Politicians. Politicians tell people things all the time. Are they in a position to know? This is another one where it depends. You got to know a little bit about your politician's expertise. What have they done? Do they have access to the correct information? It depends on what they're talking about. Do they have the skill and um, requisite training? Also depends. It's politicians are tricky to kind of pin down as whether or not they know what they're talking about. And similarly, they're also tricky to pin down about their sincerity, because again, there's this massive incentive for politicians to lie, at least the ones that are elected, because they want to continue to get elected. So if they can pass a falsehood that is going to make them look good or to make their opponents look bad, then they have an incentive um, to do so. Um, on the other hand, though, politicians tend to be sort of public figures, so you can kind of check and see their history. How often have they said things that turned out to be untrue, and how often have they been sort of sticklers for the truth, right? Have been politicians who've had pretty good track records for saying true things, and of course, there's been some politicians who have some pretty terrible track records when it comes to saying true things. So it just kind of depends. All right, one more. I just wanted to end with this just because the word testimony makes people think of courtroom proceedings. So a person on trial, right, is being asked to testify in their defense. Is the person on trial in a position to know? Very likely. So if they're being asked to know, or if they're asked about whether or not they committed a crime, they probably, very much probably know whether or not they committed a crime. But do they have a reason to be sincere? No. They have reason to not be sincere, and that's because, well, they have something to gain, right? If people believe them, then they won't go to jail, right? So put somebody on trial for murder and ask them if they killed the person, and they say, no, I didn't. Well, they want us to believe that, right? Even if they did kill the person, so they go free. So we don't just take people on trial at their word, right? You got to present evidence. Okay, I want to end with one last example, and that's ghost stories. As I mentioned previously, that one of the interesting things about talking about testimony and about personal experience is that they come together very interestingly when talking about reports of supernatural activity, and in particular, ghost stories. So we're going to flip things around here a little bit and start with the sincerity condition when it comes to somebody telling us that they've had an experience of a ghost, right? And so let's assume that they've had an experience of a ghost, or that the experience that they're describing couldn't be anything but a supernatural event. Why might they be lying about that, right? So why would somebody lie about seeing a ghost? So here's a couple things to keep in mind. First is that ghost stories are fun. So you tell a story that uh, has ghosts in it, that's interesting, and people are going to enjoy it, and they're going to have a good time, and it may sort of increase that enjoyment by having this claim of truthfulness. I know a lot of movies try to sort of make hay with stories that are, quote, based on true events when uh, those events are very not true or turned out to be hoaxes or whatever. But anyway, ghost stories are fun, right? And so people might, not tell you that it didn't really happen, just to make them fun. Uh, Another thing is that, kind of goes along with being fun and the fact that sort of people like them is that ghost stories make you the center of attention, and for a lot of people, that is a reason to sort of fabricate that you have something to gain here in terms of people thinking that you're interesting, or that there's something special about you, or whatever, that could, again, give you some incentive to not tell people that things didn't really happen the way that you described them. And here's one more, just something to think about. Haunted places are or can be a business, right? That these stories can generate revenue, and so by telling somebody that something is haunted or having a story that people find interesting uh, could again give you just sort of a monetary reason to be untruthful. So something to keep in mind. Again, not all ghost stories are people lying. but there's always this sort of concern that just taking people at their word about the existence of ghosts is a little bit naive given these incentives. Um, so let's move on and talk about the being in a position to know whether or not you've seen a ghost. So something to sort of think about is, well, why would somebody not know whether or not that they saw a ghost? Um, well, the biggest issue is that with a lot of these stories, the supernatural explanation is often sort of underdetermined. And what that means is that there are other sort of more mundane explanations for what happened that are just as plausible, if not sort of more plausible, than the supernatural explanation. And so this is something that happens to a lot of people fairly often, is that they mistake the possibility of something being true, or just being able to sort of come up with an explanation as sort of sufficient reason to sort of believe that explanation, and when that turns out that that's not actually true. If an explanation is underdetermined, then you should withhold belief. Um, and then this is the last thing I'll sort of talk about in this video, but this kind of hand waves to the next section, is that oftentimes with sort of ghost stories, the conditions under which somebody has had these experiences are far from ideal, which is to say that um, oftentimes people report seeing weird things in the dark, which is not a surprise. Dark shadows and things like that can play tricks on people. Or people report seeing things after they've been freaked out, or sufficiently sort of frightened by their situation, which again is not really an ideal sort of viewing condition. So these are things that make your personal experience sort of less reliable, and these are some things that we're going to discuss in the next section on personal experiences. So we'll talk more about sort of supernatural experiences in the next video. But for now, that's it for testimony.